What's up, you guys, and welcome back to my channel. Before I dive into today's video, I want to say a huge thank you to Audible for sponsoring today's video. You guys know, if you've been here for any period of time, I absolutely love Audible. They have an unmatched selection of audiobooks and original audio shows that you can listen to anywhere, anytime, from any device. I am a multitasker. If I'm not doing multiple things at once, I feel like I'm not being productive, and I always have a lot of work and research on my plate. Audible makes it so convenient for me to consume different audiobooks that I need for my research while doing other daily tasks like going to the gym or folding laundry or just driving in the car. Obviously, my favorite genre to listen to is true crime, but they have so much more than that. Many different categories like fiction, science, self-development, meditation. They even have the news. So there's definitely something there for everyone. Right now, I'm listening to, hands down, one of my all-time favorite audiobooks, which is actually by a huge inspiration in the true crime community and just myself in general, which is Billy Jensen's Chase Darkness with Me. I get goosebumps just thinking about this audiobook. If you're not familiar with Billy and who he is a true crime investigative journalist that kind of decided that just writing about these crimes wasn't enough and more could be done. So he went on to also help solve a lot of the murders that he was looking into. The audiobook is so incredible. Karen Kilgariff from My Favorite Murder actually is the one to narrate the foreword in the book. Absolutely love her. And then it goes on to really walk you through Billy's life and how he became interested in true crime and the different cases that he started to work on and how they affected the way he viewed his work and what he did. It's kind of to me, it is honestly the perfect balance between the crimes and representing the victims and keeping those at the forefront, but still explaining the different things that Billy himself went through and how he kind of developed his own process of investigative journalism. So I absolutely love this book and highly recommend it. If you guys want to go ahead and try out Audible for yourselves, you can go to www.audible.com/Danielle or text Danielle to 500 and you can start listening with a free 30-day trial. And to top it off, you also get a free audiobook and then 2 free Audible originals, so you guys can go ahead and grab Chase Darkness with Me and let me know what you think. Thank you again to Audible for sponsoring today's video, and now we are going to jump right in. Today I'm going to be speaking about the Bain family murders, and a lot of you may already know about this. It is the most high-profile case for New Zealand, but for those of you that don't, on June 20th, 1994, 5 out of 6 of the Bain family members were brutally shot and killed within their own home in Dunedin, New Zealand. This story is so complicated and impossible to understand or form opinions on without knowing the whole story from start to finish, so I'm going to start with Robin and Margaret, the parents of the Bain family. They met when they were in their 20s and they had kind of different personalities. Margaret was known to be loud and outgoing and boisterous and just really outspoken, whereas Robin was very quiet. He did not want to be the center of attention. He was really shy, but there were things that were in common for both of them. They both grew up in very religious Christian families, and they both had a passion for teaching and missionary work. So in Dunedin, New Zealand in 1969, they were married. And shortly after this, they had their first son named David. Now, shortly after David was born, they decided to move the family from their home in Dunedin, New Zealand to Papua New Guinea for Robin to do some missionary work. And this was a very big lifestyle change from Dunedin, and Margaret actually seemed to be thriving in it at first. The locals consisted of many different backgrounds, religions, belief structures, languages, and it all was very fascinating for her. So she kind of found herself in this huge cultural learning experience, and it really prompted this new spiritual and just self journey. They went on to have 2 more daughters, their oldest daughter Arwa and their youngest daughter Laniette, and then they had a son and their final child named Stephen. Now, David, Laniette, Arwa, they were all like 1 year apart, but Stephen, I think, was 4 years younger than all of them. While living there, Robin was the one that I believe was mainly doing the work, and Margaret was the one staying home with the kids. And she had really developed this, what the people, the locals there referred to as a unconventional and hippie lifestyle. While Robin was working, Margaret was mainly at home. She was the caretaker of the children. She was supposed to be taking care of the home, but ever since she started this new spiritual self journey, she had really been slacking on most of her other duties. She was supposedly homeschooling the children, but she would only do it for short periods of time. I believe David and Arawa did not know how to read or write for a very, very long time. She was not taking care of the house pretty much at all. There was food and dirty clothes and trash everywhere. Every corner of the house was piled with just clutter. She was super into canning fruit and then would just let it sit forever and eventually go bad. She practiced a lot of homeopathic remedies. She would let the kids just run around naked. It was just a different type of lifestyle. So at some point, obviously, things were bound to go wrong because I don't believe, and I could be wrong, this is purely my assumption, that Robin necessarily agreed with a lot of the stuff that Margaret was doing. So their marriage started to go downhill, and Margaret seemed at first determined to fix these problems. She looked to a psychiatrist that she knew to come and help the family, and the psychiatrist agreed, said that she would come and individually interview all of the family members and then figure out a plan that would best work to help their family. But she immediately realized this family needed a lot more help than she originally thought from the first moment she stepped foot into the house. The house, she saw the state it was in. It was chaos. Everything from the cleanliness of it to the disorder of the family amongst each other. And Margaret seemed to have a very different outlook on things than when she originally talked to the psychiatrist. Margaret seemed to be more concerned about losing control over the kids the older they got than fixing the actual issues within her family. She seemed worried that her children were growing older and growing into their own minds and thought processes, and she felt like she was going to be challenged by them and would lose control over them. And I think she also realized that Robin didn't necessarily agree with a lot of things, and she was worried that he would kind of gain more of the children's trust and respect, and she did not want that and felt threatened. Now, Arwa, the oldest daughter, also showed a lot of, I don't know even how to describe it. She was basically just distressed, I guess you could say. She did not like the family dynamic. She did not like the fact that she was homeschooled. She felt like she was being taught nothing. She was not living in a good environment. She wanted to go to school, and she kept just saying, I want to be normal. I want to have a normal life. So you can see that the children really are starting to realize that this way of life is very unconventional and not necessarily in like a fun out there kind of way. It was not healthy. The rest of the children seemed to speak with absolutely zero respect for Robin, likely because they're mimicking what they see their mom do, because she lacked a lot of respect towards him. She spoke down about him the entire time. And David seemed to be the only one, the oldest son, that kind of respected his father, but even then, David just seemed off. He seemed oddly close to his mom. It seemed like the relationship was a bit strange. Now, the psychiatrist then spoke to Robin, who she described as an empty shell. She said that Margaret had beaten him down so much, was so controlling, so manipulative, so dominant, that he basically just surrendered to her. He didn't say anything at all that would have crossed a line to make Margaret look bad the entire time. He kind of tiptoed around her, but he did seem genuinely dedicated to making his children's lives better, and he wanted to fix things, but she could just tell something was wrong. Now, due to the state of the house, the psychiatrist never came back to it. She was very disturbed by being within the home. She also recommended that the family get an entire team of help to fix all of the issues that were happening. Now, I have no idea if they actually took her up on this, but I don't believe they did, because shortly after 14 years of living in New Guinea, they moved back to Dunedin, New Zealand. They kind of decided, they said collectively, that they were going to come back, that the best way to save their family was to go back somewhere where they had better job opportunities, the kids could go to school in a different way. But unfortunately, despite this optimism they saw in moving back, things ended up getting much worse there. The culture was very different in Dunedin, and keep in mind, the kids grew up already unconventionally in New Guinea, and also the culture was just very different there. So they had quite a shock when they came back to Dunedin. They struggled a lot. Robin also struggled. He could not find and keep a job. He had periods of time where he was unemployed. I know that Margaret was bringing in some sort of income. I cannot remember quite how she was bringing it in, but it was basically just enough to keep the family afloat. But she was mad. She was mad that Robin couldn't find and keep a job. She was also mad because she just felt neglected in general by him and by the family, and also by the church, because they were struggling a lot and the church was refusing to help them. And it really just fueled the fire, and Margaret started to spiral. She decided to move herself fully out of the house and into a caravan that they had in the backyard of the house. And she felt she would get all this independence back there, and she would be able to continue on with her meditation and her spiritual journey away from the people in the house that seemed to be bothering her, mainly Robin. But while she had more independence back in the backyard, she also felt very isolated and stuck in her thoughts. So she heavily relied on a diary that she would write in all the time. And she basically put entries of how her days went in this caravan that she essentially spent every day crying or meditating. She also would speak a lot about her failing marriage and how unhappy she was and how terrible of a person that Robin was, and he didn't care about her needs. She would talk about the fact that she neglected her own needs. She would also write a lot about her children. Her children would come one by one basically to the caravan, from the way I understand it, and they would all talk about how they feel and how they are as a person and what they're doing wrong in life and all these things. And finally, after 6 months, she had basically just had enough. She was driving herself crazy back there, so she moved back into the house and sent Robin out to the caravan. At this point, Robin and Margaret were officially separating. At least that's what I get from it. It's a very complicated situation, which I'll explain more about later. But essentially, it just created more chaos within an already toxic environment. Margaret's diary entries at this point began to spiral, dark in a bad place. She started to refer to people in her life as sons of Belial, especially Robin. But it wasn't just Robin, it was her kids. I mean, it was her friends, people outside. And sons of Belial is basically a religious reference and means like worthless or wickedness, like sons of worthlessness and things like that. And it ended up turning from not just people that were worthless and wicked, but other things would be. Like she used this term so much in her diary that she shortened it from Belial to Bel. And she would say, you know, for instance, she said she went to her sister's house for dinner, but she said all of the food was contaminated with Bel. And then she said one day she got home and the entire house would be contaminated with Bel. And then when the kids would come to her for these, you know, meetings that she would have with them about their feelings and their path in life, she would say certain actions of theirs were examples of the Bel within them. This idea of Bel, of this worthlessness and wickedness and just her overall fear of the devil, like being in things and people and manipulating her children and her family and her life and all of that, it was really taking over her life. She even had an entire page in her diary where she had ranked the family members on levels of Belial. She said that David was always at the least amount of Belial, but Robin always had the most. So there was just a bunch of anger and resentment towards mainly Robin, but also the rest of her family and all these forms of the devil and wickedness that were popping up within her life. Now, while the marriage was going downhill, obviously that's also going to affect the children. But when these children are already in positions where they are not living a healthy lifestyle, things can get very, very bad. So David himself was constantly struggling. The whole first year they were back in New Zealand, he was not doing okay. He was not making friends. He was not getting good grades. He was not fitting in. He wasn't attempting to fit in. Very socially awkward, made a lot of people uncomfortable. But then finally, after the first year, he went into choir, and the entire family loved music, loved drama. So this was a place he felt safe and comfortable, and this kind of brought him out of his shell. He started to raise his grades and he started to make friends. But despite that, he still was displaying very scary qualities and strange behavior. He was described as someone that was all or nothing. I feel like this likely has a lot to do with the fact that he didn't seem to get a lot of affection or attention. The family was constantly fighting or arguing or being told they weren't doing enough. The kids had, lists of things to do to keep the house, but they never had good quality time with the parents, it seemed. So when he would find someone that would talk to him and be friends with him, he clung to them very, very obsessively. He would call these people constantly, want to speak for hours, want to see them every single moment of the day. And he did this a lot with females. A lot of these females he would consider as his girlfriend and make all these futuristic plans with them, but they wouldn't even know they were dating him. They would just think they were his friend. He didn't seem to understand social cues and signals and boundaries pretty much at all. Half of the girls that came in contact with him became so scared of his obsessive behavior that they stopped talking to him fairly quickly. People that visited the house also noticed his strange behavior. He had sisters, so they would often bring their girlfriends over, and most people either left early or would come and then never come back. That's kind of a thing in its own. A lot of people, a lot of the kids' friends that came to the house wouldn't come back because of the state of the house, because of how dirty it was, but a lot of people said that they didn't feel safe, and a lot of it had to do with David for some reason, and I don't know why, but there are so many reports of this. Now, as if that behavior isn't strange enough, David confided in a few male friends that he had a sexual assault fantasy. He told one friend in particular that there was a girl that lived across the street from him that he saw while he was out as a paperboy. That was his job for pretty much the entire time he lived in Dunedin. And she would go out running at the same time that he would go out to deliver papers. And he told his friend it would be very easy to get away with sexually assaulting her. And he didn't just state it in passing, which is already terrifying, red flag, inappropriate. But he went a couple steps actually further than that. He had a whole entire plan. He said to his friend that he would leave his paper route early and he would deliver a majority of the papers. Then he would go when he knew that she would be out, attack her, sexually assault her, finish his paper run, and go home, be home in time so that he had an alibi. It would look as if he was out delivering papers. There was no way he could have attacked her. So basically, David was not doing well at all. There are more examples of how the other children were struggling, but I will get into those in a little bit. Which is when the family fell apart, basically, fully. They split. So in 1990 to 1994, it was just like an explosion, basically, within the family. That's the best way I can describe it. Robin, at this point, had fully moved the caravan out of the family property, and he was now living in the parking lot at the school that he worked at. He was planning on moving into the schoolhouse. At this point, he had been in the van for, I believe, 3 years or so, and he was just waiting, basically, for the schoolhouse to be finished. And there's a lot of conflicting information when it comes to how Robin was in all of this time. There were a lot of people that stated that despite all this chaos that seemed to be going on at home, he seemed fine. He was happy. He never so much as raised his voice. He seemed to love his teaching. He seemed to love his life. He would go down to the beach and have a good time in his breaks during school. But then there were other colleagues that came forward saying that he was very, very depressed and he was not okay, exhibiting scary behavior. He was encouraging scary behavior in the students that he was teaching. But then even more people came forward that said he was great and he was attending all of his children's performances and he spoke about how proud he was of their achievements. So at this point, Robin seemed to have these two different sides to him. And the children were trying to figure out kind of how to navigate all of this. Anyone who's been through divorce or parents separating, sometimes you can feel like you have to choose a side. And that's kind of what was happening here. So basically, Robin only ended up having one person on his side. And I even say that as loosely as possible. And the one person on his side was Laniette. Now, this is so confusing, so please hang in there with me. I know this is so much information. Laniette was very upset when her dad fully moved off the property, and at one point she ended up defending him to the rest of the family, and they did not like that, so she fully left the house. She moved out, and she ended up getting an apartment. Now, she had tried to get welfare, but because she was not of age yet, her parents had to sign the paperwork and they apparently wouldn't do it. So she apparently was forced into being an escort. She had a pimp that gave her a phone, which was how she ran her business. So that's how she was living. And she didn't want her family to know about it. She kept saying she specifically didn't want David to know about it. Laniette would tell anyone and everyone she could basically get her hands on that her family was a disaster, that they, had so many issues, that they were so messed up. She would also tell some of her school teachers things. Everyone in this family seemed very open about things. Like they knew no boundaries. And she had told one of her teachers that she had a child in New Guinea, but then she went on to later say that she got an abortion, so she changed her story. She also ended up telling a small handful of people that her father had been sexually assaulting her. Now, despite this, she ended up moving back in with Robin and was bouncing around at different jobs at this point. Now, the rest of the children strongly stuck with their mother, who had started this entirely new journey that ended up involving the entire family, basically. So she said that she had received instructions from God to demolish the family home, and on that same property, build a new sanctuary for the entire family and then other people that needed to escape the public. Because again, she was so scared of the evil in the public and the devil being in people and it corrupting her family. And she said that God told her she needed to build a 7-room house where she needed to protect her family, and he was going to have her do all the plans for the house. God told her that no one else could do the plans. She had to draw them up herself because he was going to give them to her, so they would be the most holy they possibly could be. She said that God also told her that Arwa needed to go to school for teaching, which she ended up doing, and that David would be the one to actually build this house. She had basically turned the house and her children into like these workers. It had a very cult vibe to it. She used her daughter's room to draw up these plans. I mean, her daughter went to school for this because of the vision the mom had. David basically made himself the man of the house to protect them and to follow out these plans to build this house. It was just a very bizarre way of thinking, but they so strongly believed in their mother and totally disregarded their father. And this is basically the reason why Margaret never fully divorced Robin, because if they got a divorce, they would have no choice but to sell the house and sell the land, and these dreams and visions that she had from God would not be able to be brought to life. And she essentially wouldn't fully divorce him and kept him kind of hanging there, living in his caravan in order for her to act out these plans. So it's a mess, if you can't tell. And it turned into even more of a mess because the tight-knit group that Margaret thought she had with all of her children that took her side started to slip. Arwa and David stopped being okay, essentially. So Arwa was tired of her mom because she said her mom took out all of her anger on her, and she still really desperately wanted a normal life. She knew that what was going on was not necessarily normal. So she'd even met up with a friend a couple of days before the murders and told them that she was going to move out. She also told a lot of people she was very uncomfortable around David. She would ask friends to ride home with her. David was her ride to everything, to and from school, to and from outings. And she would say, I don't want to be alone with him. Will you ride with me? There was even a point where she stopped hanging out with her friends almost entirely because he wouldn't just drop her off there. He would linger and make everyone uncomfortable, including Arwa. She also mentioned to one of her really close friends that there was this family secret, and there were a few times that it appeared as if she wanted to confide in her friend. She wanted to tell her what was going on, but as soon as she would almost get there, she'd become very, very paranoid. Arwa would say, my family's gonna hear me, David's gonna hear me, I can't say this, and then she would completely shut down. But the straw that seemed to potentially break the camel's back was Laniette. She had decided that she was ready to confront her parents about what her father was doing to her. And this led up to the morning of the 20th of June and has created mass speculation on who is responsible for the Bain family murders. Now, the weekend this happened, everybody was in the house. The van was parked back in the back of the house. Laniette had been convinced by David to come home because they were having a family meeting, something that Margaret had started. They had a typical weekend. They did yard work, they went to the polar plunge, and then Sunday night they watched a nature movie that David's girlfriend had given him. David said he went to bed at around 8:30 and his parents stayed up to watch a scary movie. Laniette had decided to stay that night as opposed to leaving because she was starting a new job the next day and she really wanted David to drive her to it. Now, the next morning, David woke up at his typical time. He was the first person awake in the house. He went out to deliver papers as he did every single week, and he returned to his family dead. And this is the 111 phone call they received.
This can help you.
No, they're all dead.
What's the matter?
They're all dead. I came home and they're all dead.
Whereabouts are you?
Every street.
Oh, every street.
65 every street. They're all dead.
Who's all dead?
My family, they're all dead. Hurry up.
It's okay. Every street. It runs off Somerville Street?
Yes.
What number are you calling from?
454. 2527.
454
2527.
2527. And your last name?
Bain.
Bain. Okay. We're on our way. Okay, Mr. Bain? Yeah, we'll be there very shortly.
Authorities arrived at 7:33 a.m. and tried to call out to David, but he was not responding and would not come and unlock the door. I do believe they could hear him inside, but he just, for some reason, was not coming to let them in. They tried to kick the door down. It wasn't working, so they ended up busting glass near the door, reaching in, unlocking it, and then they had to really shove the door open because it appeared as if some items in the hallway had fallen over and blocked the door. Now, there was a current newspaper sitting on the counter, so they immediately noticed there was at least some typical activity happening in the house that morning. But other than that, the house was silent except for David screaming. They ended up finding him in a fetal position in his bedroom, screaming, "They're all dead," which is exactly what he was screaming in the 111 phone call. And an officer decided to remain with him while the other officer went to check the house, because at this point, they haven't seen any bodies, they don't know what exactly is going on, they haven't confirmed any deaths, and if there has been murders in the house, they didn't know if the person responsible was still in it. The first body that they found was in a room, a lounge, across from David's bedroom, and it was the body of Robin. He had a single gunshot wound to his left temple, and a .22 rifle was laying on the side of his body. Laniette was found next. She was still in her bedroom under the covers in bed. She had been shot 3 times in the head. Margaret was then found next, also in her bed. She had been shot above her eye. They next moved to downstairs where they found Arawa as well, dead, 2 gunshot wound in the head. They had to search for Stephen because they originally thought a door in Margaret's room was a closet, but it turned out being a door that led to another room that Stephen was in. And when they found this, they found the worst scene in the entire house. Stephen had clearly fought back against the family's attacker. He had a large open wound, a gash going down his head, likely from being grazed by a bullet. He also had defensive wounds. He had a bullet hole through the palm of his left hand as if he'd been holding his hand up to block the attacker. And then he'd also been strangled partially. There were abrasions on his neck. I believe he was actually strangled by his own t-shirt. And then he was killed with a final gunshot. He also had diamond-shaped abrasions on his back, which I find interesting. All the bodies at this point were still very warm, but Robin's was notably warmer than the rest, indicating that he likely was the last to be shot, and they believed he had likely been shot within the last hour. When this was announced to the officer that was with David, David began to go into some sort of episode. He was violently shaking. It appeared as if he was having some sort of seizure, and he ended up falling back between the bed and the wall. And the officers did pull him up, but they immediately felt like something was very off with what had just happened, because they watched this episode happen, and while his body was violently shaking, his eyes remained completely normal. His eyes were completely the same. It appeared as if they had absolutely zero reaction. Also, they noticed that his movements of his arms and his legs were very rhythmic, and when you're having, again, some sort of seizure episode, it usually is very uncontrolled. It's very kind of spastic movements. But if you're faking a seizure or an episode, your brain's going to automatically try to create some sort of rhythm to your movements. So it appeared as if he was faking this seizure. At least that's what the authorities thought. Now, they did call in an ambulance. The ambulance said that his stats were all normal. They were not elevated or off in any way. There was no evidence at all that there had been any trauma, and if he had had some sort of seizure episode, there would have been some irregularities. They also noticed that he appeared to be unconscious, but he was exhibiting reflexes that lean towards being conscious. So they also believed he faked that as well. When David finally came to, other officers were on the scene and a new officer was left with David. And at this point, they're so suspicious of his behavior that they decided to film anything he said or did because he was acting odd. Pretty soon, he started to say very strange things. He again was still repeating, "They're all dead," but then he started mentioning black hands and saying, "The black hands are coming to get me. The black hands took my family." He was absolutely freaking out. He also mentioned a pair of glasses, saying he needed his glasses, and the officer did see them in the room, but they were missing one of the lenses, and at this point, he was taken by ambulance to the hospital. Now, while he is being dealt with, the investigation at home continued because they needed to figure out who brutally killed 5 out of 6 members of an entire family. But they quickly found something that pointed directly to one person. There was a computer room within the home, and the computer was on, and it was open up to a typed up page that only read, "Sorry, you are the only one who deserved to stay." Now, it wasn't directly stated who wrote this or who this was referring to, but based on the gun's positioning, the fact that Robin was shot last, and that David was the only one left alive, the conclusion was that Robin had killed his entire family and then killed himself. And he was saying that David was the only one that deserved to live. It made sense, honestly, because Robin had basically been played with like a yo-yo. He was made to live in a van for 3 years. His children basically had turned their backs on him. This divorce was nasty, and it would have been a perfect opportunity. If he was mad enough at his family for turning their backs on him, what better time to decide to kill them all and then kill yourself than when for the first time in forever, you're all together. But they had to continue to search for evidence that really solidified the idea that Robin was responsible, and there were no other possibilities. Now, when processing the scene, the entire house was just absolutely covered in blood. It was very cluttered, we already know that, but that did not prevent anyone from seeing this was a crime scene. It almost seemed like the killer made it a point to touch everything in the house. Blood was found in the laundry room, it was on clothes in the hamper, it was in clothes that were in the washing machine. There was a watery blood print on the lid of the laundry detergent. Multiple other items on that shelf in the laundry room were also coated in blood. The door frames had blood on them. The light switches in Laniette's room and the stairways had blood in them. Blood was all over the bathroom. They even found bloody sock prints measuring 280 millimeters going from Margaret's room to Laniette's room. There was so much blood. Stephen's room was a whole other story. Blood was coating that room as well as other evidence. He had fibers underneath his nails from grabbing at whoever was attacking him. There was a bloody glove that was found underneath his mattress and underneath a pile of clothes in his room. They also searched Robin's van, and sure enough, there were 2 bullets on his bed. There were also 20 other bullets from a .22 rifle, indicating he did at least use the rifle that he was seen with. Found in his van, but those were dusty and old, so they hadn't been, messed with for a while. They even found some true crime books, quite a few of them in his van. One of them spoke specifically about a father killing his family. So at this point, it seemed pretty set in stone, but then further digging ended up taking police in a different direction. Now, the bloody gloves immediately stood out as not making sense, because if you were planning to kill your entire family and then kill yourself, what's the point of wearing gloves? It's not like, you're trying to protect yourself from fingerprints being found because you don't plan to survive the event. Plus, when they did a forensic examination on the gun, Robin's prints weren't even on there. none of his prints were on there, and he wasn't wearing gloves when they found him, and this was a rifle. To get it in position for him to manage to kill himself and shoot his left temple, he would have likely had to use both of his hands, just heightening the chance that his fingerprints would be on there. So the fact that there was none was incredibly odd, and to top it off, the gloves actually belonged to David. And so did the gun. They also found quite a few things in David's room. There were bullets all over the floor. There was 1,000 rounds of ammo that were found in his dresser. The trigger lock from the gun was found in his room. They also found what they believed to be the missing lens of his glasses in Stephen's room. And this kind of matched up with a physical altercation. Stephen put up a fight. He might have knocked the one lens out of David's glasses. So at this point, they decided to question David. He seemed to have a complete story. He said that he woke up at 5 a.m. that day and he headed out for his paper run, and then he arrived back home about 15 minutes to 7 a.m. He walked in the front door. He said he didn't turn any lights on, stopped at his room real quick to drop off his paper bag and his shoes before heading downstairs to wash his hands in the bathroom from getting ink all over his hands from the newspapers. After this, he says that he went to the laundry room, he took off the sweatshirt that he had worn on his paper run, put it in the laundry, started a few other things, and then headed back up to his bedroom where he turned on the light and then saw the first indication that something was wrong. He said the second he turned the lights on, he noticed all of the bullets on the floor and the lock for his gun, so he immediately ran to his mother's room where he found her dead. From there, he said he ran to the lounge room, found his father, and he said he could hear Laniette gurgling, so he immediately ran to call 111 for help. Now, this raised a lot of red flags. I don't know if you caught any of them, but there's quite a few issues with this. According to what David said, he had 25 minutes that he was home before he called 111. He said that he went to his room, went to the bathroom, went to the laundry room, and then back to his room. So, first of all, the laundry room and the bathroom had a lot of blood. And authorities thought, it's weird that he didn't notice all of this blood while in these locations. And also, why would Robin have gone into the laundry room? Clearly, David admitted to being the one to start the laundry. Robin would have had no reason to go into the laundry room. So, why would there be blood on the laundry detergent? Robin would not have touched that. The only person that so far would have been in there is the person that's admitting it, which is David. He also would have had to walk right past the room and almost look directly into the room while leaving his own room where his father's body was. There was also a lot of questions when it came to the way in which he found the bodies. He said that he ran to his mom first and found her dead. I completely get that train of thought. When you find bullets all over your room and you can't hear the rest of your family, running to his mom makes perfect sense, but a lot of people said the way that she had been shot and the way her body was in the bed, you wouldn't have been able to tell she was dead unless you got super close to her, which we don't know, he could have. But the one thing that's strange is that he immediately went from there to the lounge. Now, if you found your mother dead, you're going to go to the closest person you can for help. That would have been Stephen, but he didn't go in there. He also passed Laniette's room. He didn't think to go in there. He ran to the lounge where no one would have been. It didn't make sense for him to go there. The other issue is that he claimed in the 111 call that they were all dead, but according to his statements to authorities, he only ever saw his mom and his dad. He only heard Laniette gurgling, but he never went to check on the other two, so how did he know they were dead? And then they got more results back from the rifle. There was a bloody set of fingerprints on it that matched David. 4 days after 5 of the Bain family members were murdered, the 6th and only surviving family member was arrested for their murder. Now, in those 4 days, so many other odd things happened. David had been staying with his aunt, and he had a ton of different breakdowns. Again, was repeating the thing about the black hands, but he was still spending a lot of his time planning his family's funeral. He wanted it to be perfect. He would not give up any of the control. No one else could make any of the decisions. He decided what was happening for each and every single person, from the tribute that was going to be done for them. He decided, special music that was going to be played for each of them. So you would think he'd be very ready to go to these funerals. It's a form of closure, and he put so much effort into it. But in one of those 4 days, his best friend decided to visit him, and the best friend brought his dad with him. Now, when the son and the dad showed up to see David, David acted odd. David wouldn't speak to them. He wouldn't look at them. He acted as if they were not there. He was kind of speaking to the wall beside him, and they got so weirded out that they decided to leave. Now, when they left, they said they would see him at the funeral, and David said, "I'm not going." And they're like, "Well, wait a minute, why wouldn't you go? It's your family's funeral. You've put so much work into it." And all he said to them was, "Well, and that's it." When they got home from visiting David, David's friend ran into his room, locked the door, and when they went to check on him, he was hysterically crying and looked at his parents, and all he said was, "He's done it. He's killed his entire family." So even at this point, not only were police suspicious, but even the closest of David's friends were. On top of that, he also told his girlfriend that he couldn't account for the 25 minutes that he was home. He said he remembered a few things, but he had been having episodes lately where he wasn't remembering things. And he also said that he had some injuries that he couldn't explain and hadn't been there until all of this happened. There was also someone very close to him that he spoke to about a week before the murders, and he expressed to this person that he thought something bad was going to happen. And after the murders, this person came back to him and was like, "Was this what you were talking about?" And he said, "Absolutely, yes, this is what I was talking about. I told you something bad was going to happen, and now my family's dead." There was also another person that he spoke to. He told them that police informed him either his dad was responsible for the murders or he was, and his response was absolutely bizarre. He said, "If my dad is responsible, I will never be able to forgive him. But if I am responsible," and at that point, the person talking to him cut him off and said, "Oh no, you're not responsible. Don't worry about that. You're fine." But why was he even questioning if he did the murders or not? Police thought it was also strange because he seemed very forthcoming about information, and he said he hadn't been in any arguments with his dad. But they later found out through other witnesses that he had in fact argued pretty badly with his dad over a chainsaw. So why would he have gone out of his way to lie about an argument he had with his dad? It was just all very suspicious. So he basically was arrested, charged for the murders, and in May of 1995, he went to trial. Prosecution brought forward what they believe actually happened. They said that David got up at around 5 a.m., just like he stated, but they believed he got dressed, grabbed his gun and his ammunition. So they believe he took the trigger lock off, but he had left his key, the main key, in his dad's coat that was in the caravan. So they think he used the spare key that was on his dresser in his room. They believed that he went ahead and killed everyone in his family, but he didn't kill his father because his father was still out in the caravan. So at this point, he put the bloody clothes into the washing machine, cleaned up in the process, which is what covered the bathroom in blood. After this, they believed he went on his paper run at around 5:45, which would be the typical time, giving him an alibi. They think he hurried through it so that he could get back a little bit early. They said the computer was turned on from their investigation at about 6:44 a.m. They think he wrote the note and then immediately killed his dad, who typically came in at about 7 a.m. for his daily prayers. They believed that after he shot his dad, he staged it as a murder-suicide and then called 111. Now, David, the defense team, all of that stuck to the same story he had always said, and the defense team used the story that Robin was in fact the killer. They said that they had evidence that Laniette was going to confront the family, and that was exactly the kind of motive that would cause a situation like this, because when you no longer have your wife, majority of your family won't really speak to you, isn't on your side, and the only thing you have left is your job, and your job is teaching and working as, a missionary teacher, and then your daughter accuses you of sexual assault, that would take everything he had left. And they believe this was a strong motive for murder. But unfortunately, the witness that they had, the one witness, which happened to be Laniette's pimp, did not show up. So this entire idea was thrown out and completely destroyed David's case. On May 29th, after only 3 weeks of a trial, David was found guilty of 5 counts of murder. He was found guilty of murdering his entire family, and he was sentenced to life in prison. He appealed so many times, over and over and over again, but repeatedly his appeals were denied until he met a man named Joe Karam. Now, Joe Karam was a very popular rugby player, and a lot of people knew him, not just as a rugby player, but as a freedom fighter. And Joe had been watching everything unfold from start to finish and did not agree at all with the fact that David was guilty. So he reached out to him and said, I want to help you. What can we do? Together, they put together 9 points to bring it to the Privy Council in England in 2007 to hopefully finally get a retrial or have some sort of challenge that they could bring forward on the decision that he was not guilty. Now, I'm going to get into the 9 different reasons, and it's a lot, and it's going to be a lot to sit through, but they are so important and really made me think in a different way after I heard them. So the first one was Robin's mental state. Now, I've already told you there was a bunch of conflicting information when it came to Robin's mental state. Some people believed he was the happiest person in the world still. Other people believed he was disturbed and depressed. And in the very first trial, only the side of Robin that was good was shown, which, I mean, I get that, but in order to really see, the full capabilities of someone as a human being, you need to see all of it laid out, and that's just not what happened. And meanwhile, David was only described as someone as negative. So obviously that's going to sway the jury's opinion just a little bit. Colleagues had come forward since the first trial, confirming the fact that they strongly believed that Robin was not mentally stable. He was allowing publications of sadistic stories that his students had written, things about serial killers and killing family members and just very, very dark things. I've even seen that he potentially physically assaulted someone. So there was this other side to him that just was simply not portrayed. Now, there really also was no motive for either person that was fully formed successfully over the first trial. We know that the defense team brought up the fact that the sexual assault was going to be revealed, and that could completely be a motive for Robin, but nothing was really brought forward other than the fight over the chainsaw when it came to David. And also, since the first trial, 4 more people came forward confirming the story that Laniette had in fact been sexually assaulted by her father. The next point was the sock prints. They created a huge issue because, as I stated, they were 280 millimeters. That was their measurement. In the trial, the prosecution knew for a fact that Robin's measurements were 270 millimeters, so just 10 millimeters off. But they did not tell the jury this, and no one measured David's foot. And the prosecution stated that David's foot was the footprint as if it was fact. It wasn't until after the trial that David's foot was measured and found to be 300 millimeters, so a lot farther off than Robin's was. Hello everyone, this is Editing Danielle from the future. I have found something in pictures that I could not even think about posting this video without adding in. It has completely changed my outlook entirely out of everything I've seen so far, and it has to do with these bloody sock prints that I just discussed. So as you know, there were bloody sock prints closely matching the size of Robin's feet found going from room to room within the home. And one of the biggest points that David relied on to getting his retrial was that his feet were a lot bigger than these prints. Well, I managed to find crime scene photos online. There's actually quite a few of them, all different angles of a few of the bodies, especially Robin's, given the fact that he is someone thought to have possibly committed this crime. And the thing that instantly threw me was the fact that in these crime scene photos, he's wearing shoes. He has socks on, but he's wearing shoes, and there is no blood on the bottom of these shoes. You can perfectly see them in some of the crime scene photos. Let's say he left the van to go into the house to commit this crime. He's probably going to wear shoes because there's a lot of debris in the backyard. So to get from the van to inside, I can see that. But this then means that he took his shoes off to create these sock prints and then put the shoes back on. I have no idea if these socks were tested for any sort of blood, but what I do know is that led me down another path of wondering why there seems to be absolutely no blood on his outfit. We've learned through this video that the crimes were very, very brutal. Killer shot people multiple times, and there was a pretty significant scuffle with Stephen after Stephen had already been shot and was likely profusely bleeding. So the fact that there doesn't seem to be any blood on Robin's outfit is very alarming. He's also wearing a quite elaborate outfit. I mean, he's got high socks on, shoes, nice pants. He has on a nice button-down shirt with 2 sweaters on top of that, so 3 total layers. And he's also wearing a watch. And again, none of it appears to have blood on it from just me looking at the photos. So this now means that if Robin was responsible, he took his shoes off, walked around in socks during the murder, took those off and potentially bloody clothes and got rid of them. And then he put an entirely new outfit on, meaning he likely would have had to go back out to the van to then come back inside and end his life. And I don't know about you, but something about that just doesn't seem right. The next point was the computer and the time it was thought to be on. There was all this science, I guess you could say, into figuring out when the computer was turned on, because the prosecution really wanted it to fit in with a timeline that made David responsible. And I guess the method that was used was incredibly off. It was found that the time could have either been, way earlier than they thought or way later than they thought. Essentially, the prosecution's entire theory on the timeline, the way they had the family members fall in line of when they were shot and how the events all played out, heavily relied on the time from the computer, but the time on the computer was not known to be accurate. This was also a huge issue when it came to their idea of when exactly David got home, because a witness had actually come forward saying they saw David outside of the home at 6:45, which is a minute after the computer was turned on. Now, the prosecution made it seem like the witness was not really sure that it was even David to begin with, and that she wasn't sure about the time, but there are conflicting documents that state she was actually incredibly precise about the time that she saw him, and she had proof of that, and she also knew for a fact it was David, and she also was never cross-examined, so that was another huge issue. So the next point was the glasses, and the prosecution basically said that the lens from Stephen's room was the missing lens from David's glasses in David's room, and the way that it got there was from the altercation and fight Stephen put up defending himself from his attacker. Now, the prosecution apparently, and again, I haven't seen transcripts, so I'm going off a lot of different he said, she said information. Just keep that in mind. Everything is linked below. Apparently, the prosecution stated that the lens was literally found just like out in the open, like it had just popped out, like it was part of the crime scene, when in reality, it was found under an ice skate or something and had dust on it, like it had been sitting there for a while. And an optometrist also came forward and said that the glasses found in David's room were actually Margaret's. So it caused like a whole thing. The jury basically had been entirely misled about the glasses. And until I knew this information, I thought that was probably the most damning piece of evidence. So hearing that was definitely threw me for a loop, and I could see how it would throw juries through a loop. The next point was the fingerprints, the bloody fingerprints found on David's rifle. Now, David said it easily could have been bloody fingerprints from what he used the gun for, which was typically shooting possums and hunting and things like that. But the jury was led to believe by the prosecution that tests were done on the bloody fingerprints that proved it was human blood. But the reality of it was apparently that the sample taken that did test positive for human blood was from a completely different portion of the gun, and the fingerprints had actually never been tested. And then after the trial, they decided to test it, and it tested negative for human DNA. The last point that they made was Laniette gurgling. So the prosecution told the jury that the only way David would have heard Laniette gurgling is if he had been the killer, because he only would have heard these noises between the second to last shot and the last shot that killed her. But in reality, post-mortem, and I feel like most people probably know this, you can do a lot of weird things post-mortem. A lot of different things are happening with your body. A lot of different gases are releasing. You can make all sorts of noises. You can even twitch. You can suddenly open your eyes. There's so many different things that can happen for quite some time post-mortem that in no way, shape, or form does it point to you being a killer because you hear a body gurgling. That does not mean you were there directly at the time of death. Because all of this, the Privy Council decided that there was a miscarriage of justice and there was a retrial. They did suggest, however, that David remain in custody because While these are very questionable things that happened in the first trial, obviously it's not their direct decision to decide if he's guilty or not. And at this point, he is seen as guilty. He could still be very dangerous. But for some reason, he was let out on bail and he was sent straight to Joe Karam and then eventually moved into his own place. The retrial ended up being set up in Christchurch. They did not want it to be in Dunedin anymore because this was such a high profile and publicized case. And so the case began. Prosecution pretty much used the exact same tactic. They did bring in a few new things. I find it interesting because I can't find anything on this, but one of their new points was that they had evidence that Stephen's blood was on David's clothes. I have not been able to find anything else on that. It's driving me mad not knowing more about it. So if you're local and you have any links or anything, please leave them down below. They also suggested that the struggle with Stephen matched up to the wounds that David had when he randomly got them that day. They also stated that the blood all over the laundry room and the bathroom was consistent with David trying to destroy evidence. The defense team claimed a few new things as well. They said that they had a lot of physical evidence that Robin was the killer, but I don't know if any of it actually was brought to court. I do know that they stated that most of the evidence was destroyed or was never collected. Apparently 3 weeks after the family was murdered, the house was burned down. I guess the trustees and David agreed this was what they wanted to do. So any evidence remaining in the home, gone. And apparently the collection of evidence wasn't done as well as it could have been, according to the defense. For one example, they believed that Robin had been transported terribly, which I agree with because his hands were not covered when he was moved from the house to the mortuary. And he had a gunshot residue test done, but it was 5 hours after this all happened and it tested as negative. However, that in no way means that it wasn't there because A, typically gunshot residue will leave someone's skin within 4 hours, and B, it will happen much, much faster if their hands are rubbing against other things. And since his hands were not protected, they could have been rubbing on all sorts of things during transportation. Sorry if I moved a little bit in frame. I had to charge my camera real quick. I've been filming for like 6 hours now. Anyways, so one of the big issues was the fact that, again, his hands were not protected, Robin's hands, but another issue they brought up was that Laniette had diaries and had written letters to her mother, and there could have been evidence in either one of these that would prove she was being sexually assaulted by her father, but unfortunately, both of those were lost. I don't know if they had been collected and then authorities lost them, or if they were lost when the house was burned down. I have absolutely no idea, but that was all they really added to their defense. 130 witnesses were called by the Crown and only 54 were called by the defense. And after a few hours of deliberation, the jury actually came out and asked the judge to clarify what the rules of reasonable doubt are. After they heard this, it took only a little bit before they came out and they found David as not guilty. This was huge for David. He had spent 13 years in prison for the murder of 5 of his family members. While he was excited about this, and he had many supporters that were excited about this, so many people in New Zealand were livid. They were so upset. They felt they had been cheated. They felt like a murder had been released into the public, and not just any murder, someone who killed their entire family, which is terrifying. There were a few jury members, I think 2 in specific, that ended up shaking hands with David and congratulating him and hugging him and congratulating him. A lot of people got mad because those same 2 jurors ended up going to an after party to celebrate the fact that he was found not guilty. People were pissed about that, but I've also seen other sources say that they were invited by Joe Karam and they left almost as soon as arriving because they knew it wasn't right or they were kicked out. But people were not happy about that. A journalist also came forward saying he was watching 2 jurors during the trial the last 3 weeks, I believe, just giggle and write notes to each other. They weren't even paying attention to anything that was being presented. So basically, a lot of people started to question the jury and if they were either biased or they just didn't care what they were doing, and they believed that a guilty man was released from prison because of this. Now, Those that still believed David was innocent ended up launching a petition to get him some sort of compensation for being falsely imprisoned for 13 years. And regardless of what anyone's opinions were on his guilt, all a trial decides is if you're guilty or not guilty, and he had been found legally not guilty. So they were trying to get him this compensation, but he did not fully meet the requirements. In order to receive this compensation, he was told that he essentially needed to fully prove his innocence. So David and Joe started working together, and they actually took the case to Canada to be reviewed by someone, a completely different outside source, and that source found him innocent, not just not guilty. They said that it's more likely than not that he is innocent. But when he brought this information back to New Zealand, the justice minister was a new one. It was not the same person who told him he needed to prove his innocence. And this justice minister refused to accept the findings, saying that they were off and Canada was wrong. Now, I have no idea if he's still technically fighting for compensation. I know that he also somehow was awarded $900,000, which technically is compensation, but apparently technically also isn't. I've never been able to get to the root of that, but from what I've seen on a website dedicated to him and everything that happened, he is still fighting for full compensation. There are still a lot of people that believe that David is guilty. They do not think that Robin is responsible, and the evidence just points an entirely different way. Since the retrial, apparently the chief coroner of New Zealand even was questioning things, and he really wanted to take a deeper look into the deaths, because apparently in the trial something happened that proved that the death certificates of the family were all possibly off. So he wanted to look deeper into this, but he wasn't going to do it without the approval of the court. And basically what ended up happening is that it wouldn't matter. Even if they found something groundbreaking that proved that David was guilty or that something was so wrong, David can no longer be charged for anything in regards to the murder of his family, so all the work would go to nothing anyways. All of New Zealand is still divided. I've seen tons of people very supportive of David. I've seen a ton of people, really not supportive of David and terrified to live in their own communities because they feel like there is a killer on the loose, that someone was freed when they shouldn't have been. So I can't wait to see what you guys have to say down below about this. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to this story. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you have not already to become a part of the Hallan fam so we can bring them home together. And I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.